Ancient tools and burials, plants and seeds, Neanderthals. All these things we make no apology are the study of archaeology. But we don't do dinosaurs, no we don't do dinosaurs. Rated trials as one will call, no we don't do dinosaurs. No we don't do dinosaurs, no we don't do dinosaurs. Rated trials as one will call, no we don't do dinosaurs.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Archaeology Fantasies Podcast. We tackle the hot topics in today's fringe archaeology and alternative history from a critical point of view. I'm your host, Sarah, with my co-host, Kenneth Fader. This is episode 1, where we discuss what pseudo-archaeology is, how to spot it, and what role professional archaeologists should play in confronting it. Get ready to think critically.
We don't do dinosaurs, no we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs.
My name is Sarah. I go on the internet as Archaeological Fantasies. That's how you'll find me most of the time. And today I want to introduce to you guys Dr. Kenneth Feder.
Sarah, how are you? Glad to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. I am super stoked that you agreed to do this podcast with us.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, absolutely.
So this particular episode being our first episode, I just want to let you have a chance to introduce yourself. I'll probably take a moment to introduce myself when you're done, and then we'll just jump into describing how we see pseudo-archaeology and cult science and that kind of stuff, and just kind of pick a topic and chew on it for a while. How's that sound?
That sounds fantastic.
Okay, great. Well, why don't you introduce yourself to the public real quick, just in case they don't know who you are?
Yeah, you betcha. You introduced me as Dr. Kenneth Fader, and it's Ken Fader. People call me Dr. Fader. My father had a PhD, so when people say Dr. Fader, I think, is somebody talking to my dad? That's so funny. I just go by Ken. That's fine. I'm an archaeologist. I'm a professor at Central Connecticut State University here in Connecticut, obviously. Professor in the Department of Anthropology. I've been doing archaeology for over 30 years. I have a field research project called the Farmington River Archaeological Project. So we're out there in the field at least every other summer doing all kinds of interesting prehistoric and historical archaeology. And I have long been interested in public perceptions about archaeology and kind of fringe archaeology ideas. And I've written a bunch of articles. Probably my best known book is Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries, Science and Pseudoscience in Archaeology, which covers a lot of the topics that we'll probably be hitting today. I've also got a little one-volume encyclopedia of the Encyclopedia of Dubious Archaeology, which is also focused on the kind of extreme claims, the kinds of stuff you'll hear on cable, you'll see on a website, you'll read about briefly in a newspaper or a journal or magazine article that's kind of out there, kind of non-traditional, non-conservative interpretations of the past. And I think it's important that archaeologists like Sarah and me respond to this stuff because, there's a lot of this out there. And as archaeologists, people trained in archaeology, I think we have a unique insight into how you really know what you think you know about the human past.
Right. And you covered your books. You covered how long you've been working in the field. So what exactly got you interested? What was the trigger moment? Did you just wake up one day and was like, I'm going to attack pseudo-archaeology, or was it kind of a slow build kind of thing?
No, it's one of those things where I really can isolate a specific incident in my life that really set me on my way. I was in college. This is 1969, 1970. Something like that. It was our first year at college, and I came home for about this time of year, a little before, for Thanksgiving break, and I hadn't been home in a long time, and my hair, it was in 1969, right? It was the 60s, the crazy 60s. Some of my students ask me if the 60s were as crazy as they hear, and I say they must have been because I don't remember any of it.
Nice.
So anyway, so I got home, my hair was all crazy, and my mother insisted that I go out and get my hair cut. So I went to a place It was back in the day. It was called a unisex hair salon. So I didn't have to go to a barber shop. I went to a place where they did men's hair and women's hair. And I got this very nice, very talkative woman who cut my hair. And I have kind of crazy hair anyway. So it's kind of interesting and fun. And, she asked me, so you're in college, what are you studying? And here's another thing I tell my students. I say, listen, if you are an accounting major, you will never hear the following reaction when somebody asks you what you do and you say you're an accounting major. Nobody will ever say, ooh, I've always been interested in that. I'm sorry, it's just true. But when you say, oh, I'm an archaeologist or I'm an archaeology student, people's reaction usually is, oh, that's so cool. And this person, my hairstylist, said the same thing. She said, oh, I've always been interested in that. And then she immediately segued into the following question. So, what do you think about that guy who says that spacemen built the pyramids? And I had no idea I was 69, I had no idea what she was talking about. And I said, what? Spacemen built the pyramids? She goes, yeah. He's some guy in Europe, and he says the spacemen built the pyramids.
Nice.
Again, I said, listen, honest to God, they're not talking about that in any of the archaeology courses I'm taking. And she said, well, it's everybody's talking about it. Anyway, I kind of, wrote it off to some kind of crazy thing on the, that some people had heard about, but I never heard about it. I went back to college, and it was a couple of months later, and I was up late writing a paper, and the radio was on, and there was a guy reviewing books, and one of the books that he was reviewing was a book called Chariots of the Gods by Erich von Däniken. And
Nice.
I kind of heard part of it, and then I realized, oh my, this is about this is the guy. This is the guy who's saying that the Egyptians didn't build the pyramids, guys from outer space did. So I listened to the review, heard a little bit, I got to get a copy of this book. And the book had already been out for a while, and I went and bought a copy at a used bookstore, and it was, I can't decide if it was the best 50 cents I ever spent or the worst 50 cents I ever spent, but I read the book, and it was like the best way I can describe it, to me, it was archaeological pornography. It was just turn to any page, and it was something bizarre and silly and kind of crazy and stuff that even as an undergraduate with just a few courses under my belt, I knew that this stuff was crap, that it bore no relationship to what archaeology really is about and really what archaeology had shown about things like the Egyptian pyramids or the Sphinx, and a bunch of other stuff. And that kind of, for whatever reason, that really changed my life. I decided, you know what? I'm going to keep track of this guy, and then realized there were a bunch of other people writing interesting books, but that simply were not based on any kind of reality. No, it was not evidence-based. It was not based on what archaeologists actually have discovered, but it was sort of just completely imaginative reconstructions of the past that bore no relationship to what the actual archaeological record showed. And so that was kind of just a little side issue in the back of my mind, always interested in that stuff. And then what happened was I got a job teaching. This is, was ABD, right? I'd done everything but finish my dissertation. This is in 1977. So this is years later. And they gave me one of my jobs, one of the things I had to teach, along with an introductory course in archaeology and kind of the standard archaeology courses, is at my school, that was Central Connecticut State University. My task was to teach a course called Search in Anthropology. And that was supposed to be almost a pre-first course in anthropology. It was freshmen only. It just showed them how interesting your science is. So I went in there. Sarah, I had no idea what to teach. I knew what to teach in an intro archaeology course. I knew what to teach in a world prehistory course, but Search in Anthropology. So I literally went in the first day and said, hey, look, guys, I'm new to this. Let's make a syllabus. I'm an archaeologist. I'll tell you anything you want to know about archaeology. Let's make a syllabus right here. And they sat down.
Yeah, actually.
But listen, what did these kids come up with? And again, this is 1977, and it was Erich von Däniken, it was ancient astronauts, it was Stonehenge, it was Atlantis, it was psychic archaeology. And I realized we got that done with the list. It was like 95% of the items on that list were kind of related to fringe ideas about the human past. And I thought, wow, if that's really what these kids are interested in, and by sheer coincidence, coincidence. That's stuff that I've kind of been collecting for a while. Well, what the heck? Let's do a course, this search and anthropology course, and focus on those kinds of things. So I spent the semester essentially debunking or disabusing them of all this stuff. Remember, this is before there's any cable or no cable shows about, ancient astronauts or Atlantis or hyperdiffusionism or any of the kinds of things that we'll be talking about. So these kids basically had read a book, had heard something on the radio, had seen a TV show, and there were a lot of those around as well. And that class worked so well. And that the cool thing was I actually had kids after I taught that class come up to me later, the next semester and say, Dr. Fader, I saw a show about Atlantis, and I recognized all of the false claims that those people were making. And I told the people I was watching it with, you know what, this is not true, and here's why. And I thought, wow, that's really great. And the class was so popular, I decided, you know what I ought to do is make this, in fact, a regular course in our department. And so now this little kind of independent study search course became an actual course that effectively it's an ancient mysteries course. And I teach it once a year. The class fills up, and we have a great time talking about the kinds of issues that we're going to be talking about today and in future podcasts.
That's awesome. That's really cool that you got started way back at I know it's not the start of it, but it's the start of when these kind of fringe ideas started getting really big. So I think it's neat that you were able to get into the water while it was still kind of cold.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it was as crazy as it was back in the late 60s, early 70s, mid 70s. As crazy as it was, things have gotten increasingly crazy, especially recently. So that this is a terrible thing to have to admit, but these days when I read some of Von Daniken's stuff from back in the late 60s and early 70s, compared to some of the stuff that I see on cable now, he's kind of a model of good reasoning. It's scary.
Yeah.
Because some of the stuff that people are talking about now is just so off the wall. I'm not even sure how you respond to it.
Well, it's just we'll get to this a lot later, but it does seem like the television shows for the most part are just trying to one up each other, and so they're just trying to see how crazy they can get before people just stop paying attention altogether.
Yeah, and the thing about it too, and this is what drives me crazy, is that I don't know how TV works. I'm naive about that, but clearly these shows must be doing well when they go on for several years.
Oh yeah, 7 years, man.
And here's the deal, and let's look at a show like Finding Bigfoot, which is kind of related because I talk about Sasquatch in my class on ancient mysteries, and the show's called Finding Bigfoot. The show I think it's in its 6th year, and for 5, I don't know how many episodes that is, they have never found Bigfoot. So the deal here is, how many years can you go on calling the show Finding? Why shouldn't they call it Not Finding Bigfoot? Because for 5 years they're looking for Bigfoot, not finding. You know what? In The Real Housewives of Beverly Hills, they find Bigfoot as often as they find it in the show Finding Bigfoot, and that's kind of telling, isn't it?
Yeah.
And yet
people watch that stuff. They love it.
Yeah, and it's like I just remember when I was in college. You want to see something cool about the ancient past, you would watch the Nova. Nova would have on PBS would have cool shows about antiquity, and now I don't even know if they have Nova. I mean, they have Nova, but I don't even know if they can compete with the stuff that's on the History Channel and the Sci-Fi Channel and a bunch of the other channels that are just so outside of the realm of kind of what archaeology really does and what archaeologists have actually exposed about the human past. And it's depressing, and maybe that's we will not have the 4 million viewers or whatever it is that they have on Ancient Aliens, but at the very least we'll have some people listening to us, and at least whether they come here as skeptics or as believers, at least they will have an alternative point of view. The funny thing is, we've become the alternative now. The standard view on TV is the kind of way out stuff, and kind of sober, calm, and reasoned science, well, that's kind of this fringe alternative over here that nobody listens to anymore.
Yeah, I'm actually quite proud to be a member of the mainstream archaeological community, because every time somebody calls me that, it is such a physical force not to roll my eyes, because I'm like, compared to what exactly?
Yeah, I know.
What other archaeology is out there? It's just it's an interesting world knowing that, like, you're the bad guy, you know? You're like, I feel bad because sometimes, you know, people will come to you and they've got they're just so hopeful, and they tell you these stories about this stuff and these things that they figured out, and they're like just kind of like bearing it all to you, and you're like, yeah, that's not how that works. And you could just like, I feel like I'm like stepping on a puppy when I do that, but at the same time, I don't, right? Yeah, but I don't want them to be wrong, you know? I want to correct what's happening, because I don't want them to be lied to and to be deceived all of their life. And these other programs and that kind of stuff. And I feel like Von Daniken to some point is willfully doing this now. You know, I just don't feel like there's a way that, as much as he's been exposed to actual facts and all that kind of stuff, there's just no way that he can keep peddling what he does and not know that he's wrong.
Right. The thing about that is people ask me that all the time. I'm sure you get this too. So do you think they really believe this stuff, or is this just to sell books or whatever? And I actually asked that of somebody. I was recently interviewed for some cable show. I don't even remember the name of it. And it's going to be about ancient astronauts. And they had, like, the day before, had actually interviewed Eric Von Daniken. And so they interviewed me. They interviewed Jason Colavito, who's got a wonderful blog, and they interviewed us. And I asked the producer, who had just interviewed Von Daniken the day before, I said, does he believe this stuff? And he seemed to believe that, yeah, at this point, he has actually so bought into it that it's such a part of his psyche that, yeah, he really does believe it. I don't know. And ultimately, I'm not sure I care. Does it really matter? People who are peddling nonsense are peddling nonsense, and whether they're doing it for $1 or doing it because they really, truly, earnestly believe this, that bears no relationship at all to whether or not they're having a negative impact on people's perceptions. And I have to agree with you 1,000%. Especially here in the United States, adult human beings vote, and in their votes, they're voting for things related to historical sites preservation, environmental preservation, legislation that directly affects our ability to preserve the past, to interpret the past, and to present that past to the public at national monuments and national parks and on and on and on.
Right. And
so it's really important that people who are voting and whose votes are going to affect the future of the past, in essence, if all they know about archaeology is the stuff that they read in fringe books or see on cable TV, we as a profession, we've got a real problem.
Yeah.
So it really does pose a danger. It's not something we can laugh off and say, oh, whatever, we don't care what the great unwashed think. We live in a country where people get to vote on whether projects get funded, on whether parks get named and taken care of. And when those things involve archaeology, we want the people voting to understand why those places and sites are important, truly, and not as a result of some fantasy about ancient astronauts or whatever.
Well, and I think we as a profession and a field have a big issue as well, just because put the pseudo-archaeology aside, the reason people reach out to that kind of stuff and the reason that they hold on to it is because it's easy for them to get at. And there's a lot in archaeology that isn't easy for the common person to get a hold of because for different reasons. Like, you're not going to publicize big sites because you're trying to prevent looting, and you're not going to publicize, certain artifacts and that stuff because you're trying to protect it, or you're just not ready to come out with your findings yet.
Sure.
And there's just general ignorance about how the field itself works. Like, most people don't realize that after an excavation's been done, it can be 2 years or more before all of the analyzing and the writing of the reports are done. And right. 2 years, I think, is like a quick report,
Right. Oh, yeah.
And I just don't think the average person knows that. But I also feel like when the average person reaches out to the average archaeologist with kooky ideas or strange questions, questions, I feel like they're just brushed off a lot of the time and poo-pooed and not even acknowledged. And it's like, I think that's just as detrimental as allowing someone like Von Daniken to continue to tell his stories, because because now we're putting a bad taste in their mouth for professionals, and that's where this mainstream archaeologist stuff comes from, and because they don't trust us.
Yeah, we have the burden of being perceived often as we're ivory tower eggheads, you know?
Right.
We're in our ivory towers and we just theorize and we're kind of armchair scientists, and that the real people are out there, you know, in the field finding out the true story. So we've got that working against us.
Yeah.
Also, and Sarah, you know this, the average. I tell you what, when I get my issue of American antiquity, I kind of my eyes glaze over some of the articles because they are so specialized, so specific, and so dense that any normal person, even a very highly educated person with no background in archaeology, looking at those articles is just going to say, this is crazy and this is boring and I don't understand a word they're talking about. And so that's okay. There's a reason we have a journal where professional archaeologists can publish and read the work of other professional archaeologists, but that stuff is completely inaccessible to most people. Right. And so there's Archaeology Magazine and there's American Archaeology, and those are great. They have pretty good circulations, but ultimately it's websites and TV that have I think the greatest impact. And yeah, you're right. We excavate a site, and it's not just that it takes years to put the stuff together. It takes years to dig the site.
Some of them, definitely.
Yeah, I remember when I was an undergraduate and took my first archaeology field school. It was in Ohio, and while we were there at the University of Cincinnati, we got a phone call from a local developer that he thought it was an elephant tusk, and it actually turned out to be a mastodon tusk. Now, there were no artifacts associated with it, turned out, but when we arrived at the site because he was going to wait and allow us to dig it out, which was great, and he saw us with our trowels, and he said, well, that's crazy. I got a backhoe here. I can have it out in 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And oh my God. And again, that perception is, that when you show students who've never been out in the field a 2 meter square, and you say, you will be in that 2 meter square for 6 weeks, they look at you like, are you crazy? I can dig a hole a lot faster than that. So the time involved in actually carefully extracting material, the time involved in analyzing it back in the lab, the time involved in then putting it together and publishing it. Yeah, I mean, it can be years and years and years before that report is finally finished. And it's hard if you're not an archaeologist, you haven't experienced that's a difficult thing to understand.
Well, and another thing that the general public doesn't understand so well is that, and I do blame popular archaeology magazines and these kind of things for this. They don't understand that an isolated artifact isn't that big of a deal. I get a lot of people who send me pictures or ask me questions about individual artifacts that they've discovered by cruising the internet, or they think they found somewhere, or things like that. And they're like, well, what about this? And it's like, well, yeah, but what about and I try to explain this to them. I'm like, it's a neat artifact, but without the context surrounding that artifact, it tells you nothing. It could be anything. Right. But people are, one of the questions I always get asked is, what's the most interesting thing you've ever found? And I'm like,
don't you hate that?
I do. I hate that question. I hate that question more than, hey, have you found any dinosaurs lately? I hate that question because it's like they're putting too much value on a single item. And it's like, there's no one thing that I have found that is so interesting, but I can tell you about the features I have found, and I can tell you about the ground penetrating radar that I've taken, where I get a huge overview of a site. And that is so much more interesting to me than one individual item that we pulled out of the ground in this random location. Well, they're not random, but and people don't, since they don't understand context so well, they don't understand why the individual artifact isn't that important. And that's why you can get shows like Ancient Aliens, who put up those little gold bugs and try to say that they're spaceships. And it's like, it's a dragonfly. How do I know that? Because I've analyzed the entire site where that artifact came from, and it matches up with the other icons and the other artifacts in that area. That's how I know that particular artifact is a dragonfly, and that one is a fish, and they're not jet airplanes.
Well, that's the thing. The thing is that understanding context and association is a whole lot more difficult than understanding a picture of an artifact.
Yes.
And saying, how do you explain that? And I have a really great story about that. I was involved in a video documentary about the Michigan relics. And the Michigan relics is a series of just kind of transparent hoaxes, and it's lots and lots of them. In fact, this is late 19th, early 20th century. So I was involved in the video, and in that video, they interviewed a fellow who is a hyper diffusionist. He believes that they were all here. You know, if they lived in the old world, they came here before Columbus. They came here before the Vikings.
Yeah.
And he was asked to show his best artifact, and he took out. He said, "Look, this is a great artifact that shows that ancient people from the Middle East came to the New World a couple of thousand years ago." And when he picked it up, I fell off. I watched the video, and I watched him pick it up, and I fell off my chair. It was an oil lamp, and he said, if you were to go to an antique store today in Israel or in Syria or Lebanon, you would find exactly these there. And if you dug an archaeological site anywhere in the Middle East, you would find these there. But this wasn't found there. This was found in an estate sale in Virginia. And how did it get there? It must be that there was contact. And the reason I thought that was so bizarre was that I recognized exactly the style of oil lamp because my father, who at the time was living in Florida, had one in his house.
Nice.
Now, how did he get it? Well, I showed the picture of this thing to my dad. And I said, "Dad, I recognize you have one like that. Where did you get it?" And he said, "Oh, there's an antiques auction place in New York. They're online. They sell hundreds of these. They're like $50. These are legally brought out of Israel and sold to raise money for the Israeli Antiquities Association because they have so many of them. They're kind of like cigarettes. And they sell them to people who want to own a little bit of archaeology from the Middle East." And so there are probably thousands of these things floating around. But if you don't know that, if you don't know the context, that you can buy these. You can buy these in America, and that finding one, not in an archaeological site in situ in Virginia, but finding one in an estate sale means exactly nothing.
Yeah, and that's the other thing. Like, people put too much value on the story surrounding the artifact. Like with this guy, it was found in an estate sale in Virginia. How else could it possibly have gotten there? I have a theory. And it's like, yeah, but where's your evidence? And people don't understand the difference between a story, an opinion, and evidence. It's only one of those is valid. The other two are entertaining, but they don't get you anything.
Right.
So,
but that's what, and I end up, having these conversations with folks and say, but what about this artifact? What about this object? It's got writing on it or whatever.
Yeah.
And what I end up telling them is, look, think about how easy would it be if all you had to do was fabricate one artifact? How easy would it be if all you had to do was buy one artifact at an antique shop and say, put it in the ground and find it? That's pretty easy to do.
Yeah.
An archaeological site that is with house remains, with features like fireplaces and trash pits and kitchen middens, burials, fabricating an entire site is virtually impossible.
Right.
And that's why we want, if you've got something, you say this is pre-Columbian and it's from Western Africa or it's from China or Japan. That's great. Maybe that's possible. But where's the site? Where is all the detritus that would make up what we recognize as an archaeological habitation? That's really hard to fake. And if all you've got is a single artifact here and there, even if it's multiple artifacts, not in any kind of context, not in any kind of archaeological site, I probably could fabricate something like that just as easily as these guys do. It doesn't really suffice. It's not sufficient evidence to prove the claim that they're making that there was a Celtic habitation in New Hampshire, or there was ancient Romans and were living in outside of Tucson, Arizona, or whatever.
Yeah. Okay, so my history is not as interesting as yours because I don't have as many years under my belt yet.
There you go. That's a really polite way of saying I'm an old guy. Thanks.
I was being nice.
Oh, there you go. All right.
I actually got into pseudo-archaeology young because my dad enjoyed watching all of those hidden mysteries and In Search Of and that kind of stuff, those television shows. And then I just happened to go into archaeology as a career field. And while I was studying, the two things weren't matching up.
Right. Sure.
So then I started going, well, the evidence doesn't match up. And I started investigating these things. And this was just a hobby at first. It wasn't until about 7 years ago that I got really serious about it because Ancient Aliens was starting. And I was like, this is a bunch of hooey. And this is stupid. And why are people believing this?
Right.
And so I decided to start a blog. Well, about the time I decided to start a blog, I came across your book, Archaeological Fantasies. I think it had just been published, and I read a review of it. And I was like, this is it. This is what I'm going to do. And so that's why I named my blog Archae Fantasies, because I was so impressed with the idea of it.
Sure. But there's a question, because your story, that has a happy ending. So that seeing this but I'm serious, seeing this sort of crap, and I've made the argument sometimes that, look, maybe these shows are terrible, but if it inspires somebody like you to inquire further, and then you actually go into the field, maybe, there's a silver lining to the dark cloud but I think that the issue is, and here's my question to you, how did you figure out, don't pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. How did you figure out that the stuff that you and your dad were watching really was not legit?
I got really lucky, and it came down to my dad. I was raised in a skeptical family. My dad wasn't watching them because he believed them. My dad was watching them because they entertained him. Okay. And so I learned from him how to be skeptical and how to evaluate claims and evidence when they're presented. And that just further got expanded when I went to college and had some really great teachers. So that helped me out there. And I think
so. Is your dad available? Is your dad available for to help out all these other people who are watching these shows? That would be great, right?
I know, but I mean, I think you'll find a lot of people who do that. I mean, it's entertaining to me now. Now I enjoy watching them, and I enjoy reading funny stories. I mean, Eric von Daniken's book "History Is Wrong" is probably one of my top favorite books. It's like the greatest work of science fiction ever, except he thinks it's real. So, but it's a really fun read. Watching him draw all these conclusions and tie everything all together, and you're just like, man, you are way overreaching. But it's interesting to see how your mind is working. So so then I started the blog, and the blog has done well. I think it does well. Sure. And then we decided to reach out to you for this podcast, and now we're making history because this is going to be the biggest podcast ever.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So the other thing I want to move on to is, because we've kind of touched on this a few times here already, how exactly, when you are explaining this to your classes, how exactly do you define fringe archaeology or pseudo-archaeology? Do you differentiate between the two, or do you think they're the same thing, just different names?
I try not to get too much into nomenclature. I basically say, hey, look, that what I really start by defining what science is. It's a way of knowing. It's a way of knowing in which we try. It's a fact-based way of knowing. So we're not saying that we're getting revelations from on high. We're not saying that we're tapping into another dimension. We're not saying we're going with intuition. What we do in science is we look at the world around us. There's a real physical world around us, and there are all these data points. And what we try to do is see if we can figure out if there are patterns, if there are correlations, causes and effects, and we hypothesize. We suggest, all right, maybe this explains how these rock formations came into existence, or this explains how the Maya developed, or this explains how planets formed. And then we test those hypotheses against, again, hard data. And we expect most of the time to be wrong in those explanations. And when we are, we cheerfully reject them, or we tweak them, or we throw them away completely, and we start afresh, and we're not committed to or married to any particular hypothesis. We are, and that's just as a little sidebar here. The thing that pisses me off more than anything is when people say, you scientists, you're just so closed-minded. And it is so the opposite of science. It's people who have a religious fervor about belief in Atlantis or belief in ancient aliens. Those are the guys who are closed-minded. Science is all about, hey, listen, we reevaluate when we have new data. I use the example of the Norse at L'Anse Meadow. I use that all of the time. That before the L'Anse Meadow site, which is an actual Norse settlement 500 years before Columbus on Newfoundland, before that site was found, there was a lot of controversy about the interpretation of the sagas, the Greenlander saga and Eric the Red saga, which both talked about this guy Bjarni Herjolfsson, who was traveling from Iceland to Greenland. He got lost. He sailed west of Greenland, and he says he saw new lands there. And there was this controversy about, well, those were written 200 years after the fact, and can we trust them? And there's no physical evidence for that, so do we know if those are true, if those are legendary? And there were people who said, no, we think that maybe that means the Norse actually made it to North America. And there were those who said, you know what, we're skeptical about that, there's no evidence. And so while this controversy is going on, you have Helga and Einstein Ingstad, who do an archaeology on Newfoundland up at the promontory, this peninsula, and they find a site that, based on the artifacts, based on the carbon dates, based on the features, the house remains, the discovery of bronze and iron, they said, you know what? This is a Norse settlement on Newfoundland, dates to around about the time that the sagas say the Norse came west of Greenland. Archaeologists saw that evidence, and once they read that evidence, they embraced it. They didn't try to fight it. They didn't try to argue. They said, you know what? You guys have the evidence. We were skeptical. That doesn't mean we were rejectionists or denialists. It means until the evidence was forthcoming, we weren't going to accept that hypothesis. So There's an example, very clear example of archaeology being very skeptical about something. You give us the evidence. We turned around in a heartbeat and said, yep, you guys are right. Absolutely. That's now part of the book of North American history and prehistory. Yeah. We didn't reject it because we didn't like it. We didn't stamp our feet and have hold our breath until we turn blue because we didn't like it. Evidence was forthcoming. Fantastic. And listen, as a kid, I was really interested in astronomy and extraterrestrial aliens. I thought that was all cool stuff. And if tomorrow somebody excavating under the Pyramid of the Moon at Teotihuacan were to find a crashed flying saucer, I would be surprised, but I don't think anybody in the world would be happier than I would be. How incredibly cool is that? And, that's another thing, Sarah, that I found out talking to other people, that the people who are the biggest Bigfoot skeptics, who are physical anthropologists, that if Bigfoot were to walk into a mall in Seattle tomorrow, nobody would be happier than those physical anthropologists. As skeptical as they are. But how cool would that be?
Exactly. That's the whole thing. I mean, I think that's why most of us went into archaeology, is because we want to go find the cool stuff. We want to find the lost civilizations and all that. I mean, why else would we do this field, really? Right. If we were to find out that Atlantis existed, I'd sign up to be one of the first people to go dig there. I want to go to Mars and do archaeology. Come on. Can you imagine how cool that would be?
That is so funny because I actually do a lecture in one of my classes on the Mars face and all that stuff. And I tell my classes, I say, you know what? If they need an archaeologist on Mars to confirm or disprove that there was an ancient civilization on Mars, I want my name in the queue. I want to do that. How cool would that be?
I'll do the 5-year mission. I'm all right with this.
There you go.
So, yeah, but we get painted into these bland, I get told this all the time. You're just sitting in your lab in your study, reading your books and making stuff up as you go. And I'm like, no, actually, I dig holes for a living. I'm the person who's in the field that you seem to revere, but yet don't acknowledge as being an archaeologist. So I don't know.
Isn't that funny? It's funny because a lot of the people, this is an issue that you understand, and I understand, probably a lot of folks listening to this podcast understand, but it has been my experience that a lot of people think that the term archaeologist has some legal meaning, so that, in other words, a guy cannot go on TV, the thought is, and say, I'm an archaeologist, unless he has satisfied some minimum requirements. And you tell people, actually, anybody in the world can put up a sign outside their house and say, Joe Smith, archaeologist, and you're not breaking any law. So that it's, you have to compare equivalences here. If somebody has spent years in the field doing archaeology, has written, has jumped through the hoops, and there are reasons for those hoops being there, and they put archaeologist on their business card, that means something. Exactly. But when you see somebody on TV where it says archaeologist, that doesn't mean anything necessarily. And another funny story, I gave a lecture at a historical society here in Connecticut, and a guy at the end of the lecture approached me with this big fat folio full of photographs, and they were all photographs of glacial erratics. They were just big boulders in the middle of the woods, and I said that's what it was, and the guy said, "Oh well, no. They're." Interestingly, he prefaced it by saying, "I know nothing about geology, but they're not erratics," which I thought was kind of a bizarre way to start the conversation. But when he gave me his card, now this guy, a nice man, and he had lovely photographs of glacial erratics. But he gave me his business card, and on his business card, he's got no training in archaeology. He has never taken a course in archaeology. He's never done any archaeology. But his business card, in fact, in big bold letters, said archaeologist.
Yeah.
But the funny part, of course, was it actually didn't say archaeologist. It said archaeologist, because he had forgotten the O before the L on his business card. So he didn't even spell archaeology right. So maybe that's some other discipline that I'm not familiar with. But that's important. Go ahead.
No, I'm completely there with you. I went to a creationist expo several years ago, and they had a gentleman there who was, the whole deal about him was he was an archaeologist who could prove that the Earth was only 6,000 years old?
6,000 years, sure.
So that was the big deal, was that they had a real live archaeologist who was going to present evidence proving that the creationist hypothesis was correct. And so I was like, all right, this is going to be entertaining. So we get there, and he's a very nice guy. He was very enthusiastic about what he thought he was presenting. And I mean, it was just direct from Answers in Genesis. I mean, there wasn't any new material there. But when he put up his name and his credentials, it was his name, and then it was PhD, 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 MD, whatever, another set of letters. And then I think there was like a third or another PhD there. And I was just like, okay, seriously. If you really had that many PhDs, you really only have to do it once, because one PhD will cover all of them. And what, have you been in school since you were a fetus? So yeah, and it's just like, but there's nothing, even if he made all of those up, there's nothing stopping him from doing that. It's just no one in the professional field or the professional realm is going to take that man seriously. And I think that's the other distinction that people don't quite understand. Yeah, I could go out and start calling myself a doctor today if I wanted to, but I haven't met the requirements to be an academic doctor. So no one's going to take me seriously if I start pontificating with my fake doctorate. And they shouldn't. And people don't understand that. They don't understand the experience that goes behind the name and the title and the work.
And I mean, the deal here is, and let's freely admit it, merely because I have a PhD in anthropology doesn't mean I'm right about everything I say. Exactly. And merely because somebody else might not have a PhD doesn't mean they're necessarily wrong. But you have to understand that people who have gotten a legitimate PhD, they had to have a lot of training and a lot of experience in writing about, in doing field archaeology, in talking to other archaeologists, and in producing a work, a dissertation that takes a whole lot of knowledge to produce. Again, that doesn't make me better than anybody, but it's the same kind of thing that we had a pipe into my house sprung a leak the other week, right? And listen, the deal here is, I mean, maybe I could have fixed it. maybe anybody off the street could have fixed it, but I went to a plumber who has years of experience fixing leaks in pipes. Not because he's always going to be right and everybody else is going to be wrong, but recognizing that with the training and education he has, the experience he is a whole lot more likely to fix my pipe than anybody else is going to be able to do, or than somebody who doesn't have the training and experience. It's the doctor thing. It's exactly the same thing. Doctors aren't always going to be right. The MD doesn't make them gods. But you know what? If you're really sick, it's probably better to go to somebody who has trained in that profession, who has trained at a hospital, who has experience healing people, rather than somebody who says, well, I get my healing powers through divine revelation. If you want to do that, that's fine. There are cemeteries are filled with people who went to faith healers and not to medical doctors. And that's your right. That's your choice.
And I think the amount of respect that the overall professional field bestows on an individual should also have some weight there. I mean, I have met people who are basically amateur archaeologists. They have no formal training, who are held in high esteem by the professional community simply because they've been doing it for so long. They're basically self-taught, and that's fine because they're self-taught using modern methods. They don't skimp on their notes. They understand context. I mean, they're basically us. They just didn't go to college, and I don't have a problem with that. But if my choices are between that amateur archaeologist and your friend who brought you all those pictures, I'm going to pick the guy who the community says is a good person to work with when I go to put a crew together, or if I'm, for whatever reason, deciding to hire non-professionals to help out with a project or something,
Yeah, of course. I mean, we have to admit, somebody like Don Crabtree, who was a rancher with an amateur's interest in archaeologists, became probably the best known lithic replicator of stone tools that America has ever produced. And he's got a whole bunch of students whose careers are based on training at Don Crabtree's knees. And archaeologists accepted and embraced Crabtree, and he didn't have a PhD in anthropology, but it was a recognition that the work that he had done that led him to his level of expertise was as valuable as anything you could get in the classroom. And we get that. But the people who just kind of show up and say, well, you know what, I've thought about antiquity, so that makes me an archaeologist. Well, again, you might be right about some of the stuff you're talking about, but what are the odds? What are the odds that somebody who's got no training, had no experience, is going to be right? And the odds are small.
And see, that's where we come back to, well, show me your evidence. Show me what you think you've got. I will evaluate it, and I will tell you if I will accept that evidence.
Right.
Someone else may accept it. I'm very picky about what I will take as evidence, and I'm very upfront about that on my blog when people want to talk or argue with me. It's like, send me your links, send me the papers you're quoting from. I want to see what you're working from, so I can be on your page. I don't know where you're coming from. I can't just read your brain through the text that you've put on the screen. And B, I want to be able to look at what you're reading so I understand how you're forming your ideas. Just because somebody somewhere put a blog post up about something doesn't make it fact. And I'm very upfront about that on the blog as well. I'm like, you don't have to agree with me. You don't even have to like my sources. I mean, most of them are professionals and most of them are papers that you're never going to be able to access because you're not a student. But sometimes you have to trust me. And if you don't want to trust me, that's fine. That's your choice. Right. But your evidence needs to be at least as good as mine before I'm going to change my mind.
Right. When people will get angry, they'll send me angry emails or in confrontations in person, saying, "Oh, you're close-minded," and on and on and on.
I haven't had one of those yet.
Yeah. Here's the deal. The bottom line I tell these people all is, there's a very easy way to shut me up. Show me evidence.
Yeah, show me evidence.
If you're saying, no, there's really very clearly there were 12-foot tall giants walking around the American Midwest and they built the mounds. And I say, no, I don't think so. It's really easy to shut me up. Don't show me a 19th century newspaper article. Show me the skeleton. Because then I look at that skeleton, or a physical anthropologist, forensic anthropologist looks at the skeleton and says, yep, this is a hominid and it's 12 feet tall. Then all of us doubters and naysayers and skeptics, you know what we'll do? We'll go, wow, that's really cool. And we will not be doubters and naysayers and skeptics anymore. But until that happens, you know what? We're going to keep saying, we don't think so because your evidence is not strong.
So this brings us around to something I started explaining I do talks at Gen Con every year about pseudo-archaeology, and I've started throwing out cult science, or more specifically cult archaeology. And I use the example of cargo cult religions because that's where the whole idea formed. And Mr. Feynman, of course, made the term famous. But what it is people who go through the motions of performing science or performing archaeology without understanding why they're doing certain things, and also without understanding all of the steps that go into it. Like earlier we talked about, a lot of people don't understand after you've dug everything up, you have to take it back and analyze it, and it could be 2 years or more before you even write the paper. Because you've got whatever you take out of the ground is going to take months, years to go through, depending on the size of the site and how delicate the material might be. But a lot of people don't understand that.
Right. Yeah, I remember, I think the first time I encountered the term cult archaeology, it was in a paper by John R. Cole, who at the time was at UMass Amherst.
I'm not original. No.
Well, here's the deal, though. He ran a field school out of UMass Amherst on some of the monks' caves, the stone chambers of Massachusetts.
Right.
And he actually went to a conference to present his information, but it was a conference that was a lot of the folks from, I guess, NERA, the New England Antiquities Research Association, which has been a kind of hyper-diffusionist organization. And for a long time, anyhow, the standard explanation of these chambers by them was that these were ancient and Celtic. So the people who built Stonehenge came to New Hampshire and built these chambers as to mark the solstices or whatever. And John talked about the fact that the conference itself was very much like a cargo cult, that the people were going through, just as you said, going through these motions of being scientific in their research. So it was essentially, hey, we use tape measures.
Right.
Archaeologists do. We get radiocarbon dates.
Right.
So there's no context and no understanding of how the scientific process works. But
exactly.
You see the same thing, I think, in the Ghost Hunter shows and in the Finding Bigfoot shows, the various shows about looking for cryptids, is that there's a lot of equipment, They have all these meters. So their perception is scientists use meters. Scientists use equipment, and that looks kind of high tech. So they have these with them. They think that's like the cargo cult. This makes them scientists because we have Geiger counters. We have e-meters. We use total stations. That's all cool, but it's not the equipment that makes somebody a scientist.
Exactly.
It's the overall approach. But that cult archaeology thing, yeah, absolutely. But it's a general thing. It's a cult science. Look at this equipment we use. Scientists have laboratories. Scientists mix chemicals. We do that. That makes us scientists. But it's a really superficial understanding of the scientific method.
Right. I mean, even if there was a gentleman's paper, which is unrelated to archaeology, that I evaluated a while ago. And I mean, I have to give this guy credit. He did a great job of collecting data. He collected the shit out of data. But after that, it's like he just starts drawing these conclusions, these random conclusions that have no basis. And I'm just like, I will give you points. You have a lot of data, and there's a lot of interesting data here, but none of this data is supporting anything you're saying. You're just picking out little random oddities from your data, and you're not asking why these things are the way they are.
Right.
And you're not even unbiasedly stating, we found A and we found B. You're saying A is superior to B because I think it is.
Right.
But I was really amazed at the amount of effort he had put into collecting all of that data. I mean, it took him like a year or better to get it all.
Right,
and I was like, I feel really bad for you because you've got lovely stuff, but you haven't put it together.
Yeah.
But this guy, his big thing was, this is scientific. This was scientific. I did this all very scientifically. I'm like, no, you didn't.
Right. Well, you've hit on something that's really important, and it's an ongoing issue. Ignatius Donnelly, he's the guy. He's the real Atlantis popularizer who wrote the book Atlantis: The Antediluvian World. This is 1882, and I like to refer to him as like the greatest inductive mind ever. And that book is chock full of little anomalies, of little data points, but it's just he then puts them together in a way that's completely bizarre and unwarranted. But people say, well, he was a scientist because look at all the facts. I mean, I have literally heard people in responding to books that I have been highly critical of and say this is pseudoscience, and their response is, yes, but look at all the footnotes, as if the number of footnotes is directly proportional to the legitimacy of the argument. But there too, that's I think another good example of what you were talking about, this kind of cult archaeology or cult science. You open a science book and there are a lot of footnotes and a lot of references. So to have your book be scientific, you need a lot of footnotes. But footnotes don't make a book scientific, and yet that seems to be the approach.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you there. Okay, so you keep using the term hyperdiffusionist, and I know what you're talking about. Sure. Just in case someone on the show doesn't, can you give us a quick definition of what hyperdiffusionism is?
Yeah, you bet. I mean, we can put this in a much greater, larger context, which is that way back in the 19th century, a lot of anthropologists were sort of diffusionists. The basic notion of diffusionism is that people, for the most part, are pretty conservative and slow and dim-witted, and there are only a very limited number of kind of brilliant cultures in the world. And for some diffusionists, there's one, that's ancient Egypt. And that all of the stuff archaeologists see all over the world, developments like agriculture and metallurgy and a writing system and monumental architecture and the arch and on and on and on, that all of these things that we see everywhere, instead of them having developed independently by people from the sweat of their brow, just working hard, instead, they all can be traced back to one source, like Egypt, or a handful of sources like Egypt and Mesopotamia, and that the ideas diffused or moved out from those source areas to everywhere else in the world. So that if you find pyramids in Egypt, and there are pyramids, we use that term, in Mexico, well, the Mexicans couldn't have figured out pyramid building by themselves. So the idea of pyramid building must have moved across the Atlantic, and that's what inspired the people of Mexico to build pyramids. So they didn't invent pyramids, they borrowed the idea. It's all about idea borrowing.
Or they were taught it. In its kind of crudest
form, hyperdiffusionism is, you see something in North America and you explain it as that there were visits here through antiquity of people from all over the rest of the world. I mean, it's interesting that very few cases does anybody claim that Native Americans sailed across the Pacific or the Atlantic and made it somewhere else. It's usually the claim is made that America was the recipient of all these other societies, other cultures, and ideas from all over the world. So that and ultimately it's predicated on a pretty insulting assumption, which is that Native Americans didn't have the capability to develop and invent these things on their own. So when we see it in the archaeological record, well, the idea must have come from someplace else. It must have diffused from someplace else. Now, diffusion happens in the world. People trade thoughts and ideas, and they spread their genes around. But hyperdiffusionists just see it under every rock and don't require the kind of high level of evidence that really is required in a case like this. I mean, it's possible that people made it to the New World before Columbus. Well, we know that happened. Here. It's possible that people made it to the New World before the Norse. But again, we need physical evidence, not just so stories of, well, there are pyramids here, there are pyramids elsewhere, so there must be, they must have all come from the same place.
Well, the term pyramid, depending on who's using it, can be such a broad term. It covers so many structures years. Yeah, I don't like this borrowing of terms and redefining them thing, because it's like, you think you know what you're talking about, and they're not talking about what you think they're talking about. And that just causes issues.
Yeah, oh no, you're absolutely right. I wish there were another word for these buildings that are big on the bottom and smaller on the top that we see in Mesoamerica. Because, you say, right, you're right. You say pyramid, I say pyramid. Somebody hears pyramid, they think we're talking about exactly the same thing. The pyramids of Egypt are true geometric pyramids, and they are four triangles, right, that all meet at a common apex. That is the geometric definition of a pyramid. That's not what we see. In fact, in Mesoamerica, they're actually trapezoids, right? Or truncated pyramids. But they certainly aren't the same thing, even in terms of their general appearance. Again, when people say to me, yes, but there are pyramids all over the world, I say, well, you know what? If you're going to pile up a lot of rocks, it kind of makes sense to make it big on the bottom and smaller as you go up. Because if you do it the reverse, if you try to make a building that's really tiny at the bottom and gets bigger on the top, they keep falling over.
Well, and I mean, the pyramid shape itself is like one of the most stable shapes in the world. It wouldn't take very long to figure that out.
Oh, sure.
It's like people who freak out about the quartered cross and how it shows up everywhere. All written languages have a quartered cross. I'm like, yeah, how hard is it to draw a circle and put a plus sign inside of it? You're going to see that everywhere. They're basic shapes.
I was in a Three Rivers petroglyph site, which is in southern New Mexico near Tularosa. And there are exactly those. These things look like Celtic crosses, or they look like German crosses, and they're petroglyphs, and they're all over these boulders. We know exactly who produced these. We know where they lived. We know where their villages were. And it's just, you're right. People are going to come up with very similar ideas in various parts of the world. So the mere similarity is not a really good argument, especially when we're talking about something as simple as a cross.
Right. Yeah, we're going to have to touch on this more in another episode. That and linguistic evidence, because I'm getting a little tired of that stuff too.
Sure.
But we are coming up on, I think, an hour for our first episode. And since we've come to a good
really
stopping
quick.
point.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it did, didn't it?
For sure.
So why don't we wrap up here? Do you have any final thoughts you want to throw out there before we bow out gracefully?
Now, I mean, the very last thing I'd like people to know is that people like Sara and me and other folks who are considered to be traditional or conservative archaeologists, man, this stuff, we're jazzed about this stuff. We are really interested and passionate about the human past. So it's not, we don't look at our roles in this as, party poopers and raining on everybody's parade. We think that the real deal of the archaeological record, the real archaeological record, is a whole lot more interesting and it's more fascinating and more important than the fantasies that people make up about the human past. So the real deal archaeology isn't boring and dull. It's incredibly exciting and incredibly interesting. And how much more interesting is it to know what the real story is based on evidence, rather than something that somebody has made up?
Oh, and I'm with you right there. I think it is so much more amazing to see the things that we as humans have created and done to deal with just life and living in the past. I just find that so much more interesting than anything they can make up. I mean, it's that God and the machine thing. Oh, the aliens came and did it for you. Well, that's no fun. It's so much more fun to say that, the ancient Greeks actually knew clockwork and knew how to use steam technology, and that's how they were able to create the Antikythera mechanism.
Right. How cool
that's something
is that?
we built. We built a computer. We built a computer before we even knew what computing was, and we used ancient Babylonian formulas to make the thing work. So I find that so much more interesting.
I like the idea that in the future, extraterrestrials will actually, for the first time, arrive on Earth, and the ancient aliens crowd will say, Tell us, you built the pyramids. And they're going to go, Are you guys high? we would have done a much better job than that. We can build
Right.
spaceships that can go across interstellar space. Are you kidding me?
We can go faster than light. We're not building stone pyramids to record
Yeah.
anything.
Yeah, that's the whole rationale behind, aliens arrive on Earth and build pyramids or mate with Australopithecus or make giant spiders in the desert of Peru.
Right,
I mean,
yeah.
that's a story for another podcast.
Yeah, we'll totally get into individual stuff at a later time. Well, thank you very much, Ken, for being on the show. I'm just really looking forward to doing more of these with you.
This is great, Sarah. Thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate that, and I hope people appreciate the podcast and give us some feedback, and we'll continue.
Yeah, definitely give us feedback, and we will address that on the show because it'll be fun to read emails.
Extrapolating from a single stone the extent of a whole complex and then publishing it.
If you'd like to support the podcast, consider donating to us on Patreon or Ko-fi. Either option helps us out. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on the blog, www.archaefantasies.com, and like and share us wherever you can. You can follow us on Twitter @ArchaeFantasies, or you can reach us by email at archaefantasies@gmail.com. That's ARCHY fantasies@gmail.com. Theme music was provided by Archaeosuit Productions. This episode was produced and edited by Sarah Head.
Dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs. We don't do dinosaurs. See? Are you happy? Do you get it now? Do you get it? Honestly.